Picture this. It's the mid-20th century. Your grandfather, let's call him El Molasses, up his boots, walks into a factory, and clocks in with nothing but a high school diploma, a union card, and a pulse. He works full-time, comes home tired, still manages to buy a modest 3-bedroom house for roughly 2 to 3 times his annual income. That wasn't a fairy tale. That was the architecture of a country. In the 1950s and 1960s, the median U.S. home price hovered around $7,000 while median household income sat around $3,000 to $3,500. Mortgage rates were comparatively stable. Zoning was permissive. Land was cheap. Developers built quickly. And housing was treated first and foremost as shelter. A place to live. A place to raise kids. A place to rest. The American dream wasn't aspirational branding. It was structurally achievable. Now wake up. It's 2024, bleeding into 2025, and everyone's pretending this is normal. You have a master's degree, a LinkedIn profile full of skills, a caffeine tolerance that should qualify as a military contract. And you're doing mental gymnastics at midnight, trying to decide whether selling a kidney counts as a down payment strategy. Today, to afford the medium-priced U.S. home, a household needs an annual income hovering around $110,000 to $115,000, depending on interest rates. That's more than double the national median household income, which sits around $75,000. The median home price is roughly $420,000. Mortgage rates have floated around 6.5% to 7.5%, turning monthly payments into a slow-motion chokehold. That white picket fence isn't a symbol of freedom anymore. It's a load-bearing financial liability. And this isn't just vibes, it's balance sheets. The United States is sitting on a housing affordability crisis with a price tag north of $1.7 trillion up. Rough measure of inflated asset values, excess household debt, and the cumulative cost of turning homes into investment vehicles instead of places to live. So grab a drink, cheap one, because rent is due. Tonight, we're investigating what murdered the American housing dream. And we're not going to blame it on avocado toast. We're going to follow the money, the incentives, and the quiet policy choices that built a system where the average young adult isn't behind. They're simply locked outside the gate. Because here's the darkest truth. This didn't happen overnight. Happened slowly, legally, respectably. 1,000 small decisions that felt harmless in isolation, till they stacked into a wall no one can climb. To understand the collapse, we're going to start with the most basic ingredient of any housing market: supply. Because before Wall Street arrived, before boomers stayed put, before remote workers flooded small towns, the first domino fell in silence. We ran out of houses. And yes, you see cranes. You see construction. You see shiny condos rising like glass weeds in downtown cores. But what you're seeing is a drop in a very, very dry bucket. After the 2008 financial crisis, U.S. homebuilders didn't just slow down, they changed personality. The subprime collapse didn't only wipe out homeowners, it wiped out developers, crushed lenders, and taught every surviving builder the same lesson: don't get caught holding inventory when the music stops. So for more than a decade, America underbuilt relative to population growth. Year after year, new household formation outpaced new supply. And like any shortage, it didn't scream at first. It whispered, then it compounded. Today, depending on who you ask and how you count, estimates from major housing groups and economists put the U.S. housing shortfall somewhere between roughly 3.5 million and 7 million homes. That's not a rounding error. That's entire metropolitan areas that do not exist. And the shortage doesn't behave like a normal problem. It behaves like gravity. It pulls everything toward scarcity. When supply is thin, every other force investors' rates, demographics hits harder. But the shortage is only the first half of the poison. The second half is worse. Because even the houses that exist don't circulate. This is the part that turns the market from expensive into frozen. Economists call it the lock-in effect. I prefer the more honest phrase, golden handcuffs. Here's how it works. Meet Bob. Bob bought a house in 2020 or 2021, right before the Federal Reserve slammed on the brakes. He locked in a 30-year fixed mortgage at a dangerously sexy 2.8%. His monthly payment feels like financial anesthesia. Predictable, affordable, almost calming. Now Bob wants to move. Maybe it's a new job, maybe a growing family. Maybe he hates the neighbor's leaf blower with the intensity of a religious feud. But Bob looks at today's mortgage rates 6%, 7%, and he does the math. If Bob sells and buys another home at the same price, his monthly payment doesn't rise a little, it explodes. From something like $600 to something that feels like $3,000. Is Bob moving? No. Bob is remodeling the kitchen. Bob is tolerating the neighbor. Bob is dying in that house. And Bob isn't a character. He's a statistic. As of the mid-2020s, a massive share of outstanding U.S. mortgages carry interest rates below 4%, many below 3.5%. Tens of millions of homeowners are financially trapped. Not because they can't pay, but because moving would permanently downgrade their standard of living. So the market becomes a museum. Homes are locked in place by cheap debt, and new buyers are forced to fight over whatever scraps leak onto the market. That's why something weird happened in 2023 and 2024 that confused almost everyone. Normally, when rates spike, home prices are supposed to fall. Borrowing gets expensive, demand drops, prices correct. But this time, prices stayed near record highs. Why? Because while demand weakened, supply evaporated. Basic economics twisted into a horror movie. If 10 buyers are fighting over one house and 5 drop out because rates are too high, you don't get a crash. You still have 5 buyers fighting over the same house. Prices don't fall, they stick. Or they climb. And that brings us to the most depressing ratio in modern American life. Back in Elma's era, the median home cost roughly 2 to 3 times median household income. Today, it's closer to 5 to 6 times nationally. And in high-demand metros Los Angeles, San Jose, San Francisco, New York, that ratio can blow past 8 to 10 times. The ladder to the middle class hasn't just been pulled up. It's been set on fire. And while regular families are fighting for scraps in a frozen market, there's another player at the table, one that doesn't care about mortgage rates at all. If the American housing crisis had a single invisible trigger, it would be this. We didn't just make homes expensive, we made homes scarce. And scarcity changes the personality of an entire economy. Let's go back to Elma for a second. When Elma bought in 1955, the market had options. Developers were throwing up bungalows like confetti. Suburbs expanded outward. Zoning was permissive. Land was cheap. Construction moved fast. Supply met demand. They shook hands, and everyone went home to watch I Love Lucy. Cut to 2024, sliding into 2025 and early 2026. The housing market isn't a handshake anymore. It's a cage match where the prize is a 900-square-foot fixer-upper that smells faintly of cat urine and regret. The first pillar of this disaster is brutally simple. America stopped building enough homes. Yes, you see cranes. You see new luxury apartments downtown. You see now leasing banners everywhere. But those are droplets. The bucket is dry. After the 2008 financial crisis, homebuilders didn't just slow down. They were traumatized, financially and psychologically. Developers went bankrupt. Small builders vanished. Lenders tightened credit. And the surviving giants learned a new religion. Don't build unless you're sure the buyer is already there. For more than a decade, construction lagged behind population growth and household formation. The U.S. built fewer homes than it needed year after year, like a country living off inventory while pretending it's income. The result is a cumulative housing deficit. Estimates range widely depending on methodology. But major analyses put the shortfall somewhere between millions of units, not thousands. Millions. Entire cities' worth of housing that simply never got built. And then came the second half of the poison. Even the homes that exist, they don't move. They don't circulate. Economists call this the lock-in effect. I call it what it feels like. Golden handcuffs. Here's the mechanism. Meet Bob. Bob bought his home in 2020 or 2021 and locked a 30-year fixed mortgage at around 2.8%. Rate so low, it now sounds like a typo. His monthly payment is manageable. Predictable. It's the closest thing modern Americans have to financial peace. Now, Bob wants to move. New job, new baby. New city, or maybe he just hates his neighbors. But Bob looks at today's mortgage rates hovering around 6 to 7% and does the math. If he sells his house and buys another one at the exact same price, his payment doesn't rise a little. It detonates. And Bob doesn't need a finance degree to understand what that means. So Bob stays. He remodels the kitchen. He adds a shed. He tolerates the neighbors. He becomes a long-term occupant, not because he's loyal to the community, but because the math won't let him leave. And Bob is not rare. A massive share of U.S. homeowners are sitting on mortgages below 4%, many below 3.5%. Tens of millions of households are financially trapped not by poverty, but by an interest rate cliff. Moving would permanently downgrade their lifestyle, so the market freezes. Inventory vanishes. And then the weirdest thing happens, something that broke every normal rule people learned about rates and prices. Normally, when interest rates rise, home prices fall. Borrowing becomes expensive, demand drops, and the market corrects. But that didn't happen in 2023 and 2024. Prices stayed high. Why? Because while demand weakened, supply collapsed. Basic economics turned into a horror film. If 10 buyers are fighting over one home and 5 drop out because rates are too high, you don't get a crash. You still have 5 buyers fighting over the same home. Prices don't fall, they stick, or they creep upward. So we entered a reality where higher rates didn't fix affordability. They cemented it, because higher rates didn't just scare buyers. They also handcuffed sellers. And this is why the affordability ratios feel like science fiction. In the 1950s and 1960s, the median home cost about 2 to 3 times median household income. Today, the median home price is closer to 5 to 6 times median income nationally. And in high-demand metros Los Angeles, San Jose, San Francisco, New York, that ratio can blow past 8 to 10x. That's not a market. That's a barrier. A toll gate to adulthood. A system where saving responsibly feels like running up an escalator that's moving down. And just when people try to make sense of it, they reach for the comforting idea. Okay. But if rates are high, at least investors will back off. Except investors aren't you. They don't think like you. They don't borrow like you. They don't live in the house. They harvest it. Because while the inventory drought is the gasoline, the next force is the Zippo. And it doesn't care about your mortgage rate. It pays cash. If the inventory drought is the gasoline, then Wall Street is the man standing next to it with a Zippo lighter and a very calm smile. You've probably heard the argument by now. It usually comes wrapped in a reassuring tone and a fact-check badge. Relax. Institutional investors only own a small percentage of U.S. single-family homes. Technically, that's true. And functionally, it's meaningless. Because housing markets don't collapse at the national average. They collapse street by street, zip code by zip code, neighborhood by neighborhood. Saying Wall Street owns a small share of all homes is like saying piranhas only live in a small part of the river comforting, unless that's exactly where you're trying to swim. Here's the real model. Institutional investors didn't scatter across America randomly. They targeted entry-level single-family homes, fast-growing Sunbelt metros, neighborhoods with good schools, strong job growth, and long-term rental demand. Places like Atlanta, Phoenix, Tampa, Charlotte, Dallas, Houston, parts of Florida, and Arizona. And in those markets, their footprint isn't small. In certain quarters across 2024 and 2025, investors accounted for a quarter or more of all single-family home purchases in specific metro areas. Not nationwide. Locally, where first-time buyers were already stretched thin. Now picture what that looks like in real life. You show up to an open house. You've got a mortgage pre-approval. You like the place. You make an offer at asking price. You write a nice letter about raising a family. Then an institutional buyer steps in. All cash, no inspection. Closing in 7 days. 10, 20, sometimes $50,000 over asking. You lose? Not because you were irresponsible, not because you didn't budget, but because you were competing against capital that doesn't borrow at consumer rates and doesn't care about monthly payments. This isn't accidental, it's a strategy. Investor earnings calls don't talk about neighborhoods or community stability. They talk about yield optimization, rent growth, fee expansion, and algorithmic pricing that adjusts faster than your paycheck. Homes stop being shelter. They become cash flow instruments. And the endgame isn't flipping. The endgame is permanence. A rental society where corporations own and households subscribe. Where equity compounds for balance sheets and rent resets annually for everyone else. By the late 2020s, projections from major investment firms openly suggested institutional players could dominate the single-family rental supply in key metros. Not owning everything, but owning the part that matters. The starter homes. The ladder rungs. And once those rungs are gone, mobility disappears. But surely, this is where the optimists step in. Surely, demographics will fix it. Surely, the baby boomers will sell. Surely, the silver tsunami will arrive and flood the market with inventory. That was the bedtime story. It just never came true. The silver tsunami didn't crash. It calcified. Baby boomers control tens of millions of owner-occupied homes and an enormous share of housing wealth. And instead of selling en masse, they did something most models underestimated. They stayed, they aged in place. And when you run the math, it makes brutal sense. Many boomers own their homes outright. No mortgage. Minimal monthly costs. Selling means paying agent fees, moving expenses, higher housing costs elsewhere, and potentially capital gains taxes. Why trade a paid-off home for a smaller one that costs almost as much? Why downsize into an expensive condo with HOA fees and less autonomy? Why move into assisted living that costs more per year than most people earn? And then there's the quiet tax incentive nobody likes to talk about. If you sell a home while alive, you may owe capital gains taxes on decades of appreciation. If you hold it until death, the tax basis resets for heirs. From a purely financial perspective, not selling is rational. So homes don't circulate. Tenure lengths stretch. The average homeowner stays put far longer than previous generations. Homes stop being transitional assets. They become retirement vaults. The result is a generational stalemate. Younger families aren't competing against villains. They're competing against incentives. Against math. Against a system where every rational choice by one group locks another out. And if you can't buy existing homes, and boomers aren't selling. And investors are scooping up what does come to market. Then the obvious solution sounds simple. Build more homes. Specifically, build modest, affordable starter homes like the ones that once defined the middle class. Except there's a problem. That product no longer makes economic sense. And that's where the system breaks completely. Because the starter home didn't just become rare, it became unbuildable. And in the next section, we're going to follow the numbers land. Regulation, labor, insurance, and show why the American housing ladder didn't just lose rungs. It stopped being manufactured at all. If the American housing crisis were only about investors and boomers, it might still be fixable. But the real collapse happens one layer deeper inside the economics of building itself. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The starter home didn't disappear by accident. It disappeared because, in modern America, it no longer pencils out. In the 1970s, roughly 40% of newly built homes were considered entry levels, small, simple, and affordable. By the early 2020s, that share collapsed into single digits. By the mid-2020s, estimates placed it under 7%. Homes didn't just get bigger, they got structurally more expensive to build. And not because developers suddenly became cartoon villains twirling mustaches. They became accountants. Let's run the numbers. Pretend you're a builder in 2024 or 2025. You want to construct a modest starter home. 1,200 to 1,400 square feet. First problem? Land. Zoning laws, minimum lot sizes, parking requirements, and neighborhood resistance have made buildable land near job scarce. Even in secondary metros, a buildable lot can easily cost $80,000 to $150,000. Second problem, regulation. This is where most people dramatically underestimate the damage. Permits, environmental reviews, impact fees, legal compliance, inspections. These costs are largely fixed. They don't shrink when the house does. In many states, regulatory costs alone can account for 20 to 30% of the final home price before a single nail is hammered. Third problem, labor and materials. The construction workforce is aging. Skilled trades were hollowed out for decades as young workers were pushed into college. Wages for electricians, plumbers, and HVAC technicians surged. Materials lumber, concrete, wiring remain structurally more expensive than pre-pandemic levels, added up conservatively. Land, $100,000 regulation and permits, $70,000, $90,000. You're already flirting with $320,000, $350,000 before financing costs, risk, and profit. Now comes the brutal incentive problem. If you build a small home and sell it for $350,000, you might clear $15,000, $25,000, assuming nothing goes wrong. But if you build a larger, higher-end home on the same lot, your land and regulatory costs barely change. You spend more on finishes and square footage, but now you sell for $650,000 or $750,000. Your profit jumps to six figures. This isn't greed. It's arithmetic. So builders stop making cheap homes. Not because they hate first-time buyers, but because the system punishes anyone who tries to serve them. The result is what economists call a barbell market. Luxury homes on one end, aging rentals on the other, and almost nothing in between. And when selling no longer works, developers pivot. They don't sell at all. They rent. Entire subdivisions are now built specifically as single-family rental communities, owned by institutional landlords from day one. These homes look like starter homes, but they're never meant to be owned. You don't climb the ladder, you subscribe to it. And just when people thought they could escape by moving somewhere cheaper, the final illusion shattered. The Zoomtown moment. During 2020 and 2021, it looked like geography had saved the American dream. Remote work let high earners flee coastal cities for places like Boise, Austin, Bozeman, Bend, Asheville. For a brief moment, housing markets aligned with local wages. Then the laptop class arrived. High-income remote workers parachuted into low-cost towns with cash, stock gains, and no attachment to local price norms. To them, a $400,000 home felt cheap. Prices exploded, often 40 to 60% in 2 years. Then came the hangover. Return to office mandates hit. Tech cooled. Some transplants tried to sell. Prices corrected, but never back to pre-pandemic levels. Locals still couldn't afford them. Transplants didn't want them. Liquidity vanished. The crisis didn't disappear. It spread. And just as housing became unaffordable, insurance quietly became lethal. By 2025 and 2026, home insurance morphed into a second mortgage. In Florida, average premiums surged past $6,000 per year. In wildfire-prone parts of California, major insurers stopped writing new policies entirely. Across the Midwest and Northeast, storms and replacement costs drove relentless premium inflation. Miss this detail and your escrow payment can explode overnight. Fail to insure and the bank places coverage at ruinous rates. Homes didn't become unsafe. They became financially toxic, which creates a final filter. Who can buy homes that are hard to insure, hard to finance, and expensive to maintain? Cash buyers, institutions. The wealthy, once again, not through conspiracy, but through math. And this is where the crisis stops being cyclical and becomes existential. Because when housing stops functioning as shelter, when it stops being attainable, when it stops being transferable between generations, it stops anchoring the middle class. And in the final section, we're going to confront what this does to people, not balance sheets. Because the real casualty of the housing crisis isn't just ownership. It's time, delayed lives, paused futures. A generation stuck, waiting for a crash that never comes. And that kind of pressure doesn't stay economic forever. It turns social. At some point, the housing crisis stops being about real estate. It becomes about time. Time delayed, time stolen, time suspended. Economists love charts. They model interest rates, housing starts, and price-to-income ratios. What they almost never measure is despair per capita. If they did, the needle would snap. Because we are living through a psychological phenomenon that quietly defines this era. Doom spending, not reckless, rationale. A 27-year-old with a decent salary opens Zillow, runs the numbers, and realizes they need $80,000 to $120,000 just to enter the game. At current prices, that takes a decade to save, assuming nothing goes wrong. During that same decade, home prices rise by $15,000 to $30,000 per year. Something inside them breaks, so they stop pretending. They book the trip, the jacket, order the latte. Not because they're irresponsible, but because delayed gratification no longer guarantees a reward. Saving feels irrational when the finish line keeps moving faster than you can run. This despair feeds into another misunderstood trend: adults living with their parents. By the mid-2020s, roughly one-third of Americans aged 18 to 34 lived at home, the highest share since the Great Depression. This is framed as laziness. It isn't. It's adaptation. In most of the world, multi-generational living is normal. In America, it feels like failure because our identity was built on independence through ownership. But when rent eats half your income and buying is mathematically blocked, staying home isn't regression, it's survival. The real cost isn't financial, it's developmental. People delay marriage, delay children, delay risk, delay life. Birth rates fall, careers stagnate, communities thin out. Sociologists call this rotting in place state, where effort doesn't compound and patience is punished. You're not failing forward. You're waiting. Waiting for prices to crash. Waiting for rates to fall. Waiting for anything to break the stalemate. But the crash never comes. Because this isn't a bubble in the traditional sense. It's a structural shift. Your definition of the American housing dream is work hard, buy a home at 25, retire comfortably at 65. Then yes, that version is dead. It wasn't lost. It was dismantled by supply shortages, by institutional capital, by policy choices that turned shelter into an asset class and time into collateral. The $1.7 trillion housing reality isn't a glitch. It's the system we built. And here's the uncomfortable part no one wants to say out loud. The United States is drifting toward a housing model that already exists elsewhere. Higher long-term renting, smaller spaces, later household formation, more multi-generational living. A European-style housing reality without Europe's safety nets. That doesn't mean life is over. But it does mean the rules changed quietly, permanently, and without asking for consent. Here's the silver lining most people miss. You're not lazy. You're not bad with money. You're not broken. You're operating inside the most hostile housing affordability environment since the Great Depression, adjusted for income. Previous generations didn't win because they were smarter. They won because the game was easier. Recognizing that isn't self-pity, it's clarity. The American dream isn't gone. It's just no longer one size fits all. Adaptation isn't surrender. Buying with friends or family. House hacking. Relentless job hopping. Geographic flexibility when possible, or redefining fulfillment beyond a 3-bedroom house and a fence. These aren't failures. They're survival strategies in a rigged environment. The worst thing you can do is internalize a systemic failure as a personal one. Homeownership is no longer the default reward for adulthood. That's destabilizing. But pretending otherwise is worse. Understanding the system doesn't guarantee victory. But it does prevent you from blaming yourself for a game designed to exclude you. And that understanding, more than any interest rate cut or policy headline, is the first step toward reclaiming agency in a world where the dream didn't disappear. It was repriced.